Hey everybody, good morning. Just got another minute or so till class time, but welcome back. Hope you guys had a great weekend, and I'll be right with you. So, hello and good to see you guys. Hey AJ, hey Monica. Good morning. Johnny. And Ashley, Fernando, Brianna, John, Ryan, good morning everybody. Delilah. Hope everything's going swell. Hi Sky, Nicole, Raheem. Okay guys, well welcome back as usual. Here we are and it's Tuesday, March 23rd. We're going to have one more meeting to try and get more of these fallacies out of the way today. And then, of course, Thursday is our last day before we have spring break. So let me just make sure to everyone that we're clear on a few things. Did you happen to notice my announcement with the details of the second homework? Let me know if you received that last, I think Friday I sent it off. But anyway, I made a slight adjustment to the due date that you would see listed there for that assignment. So it was originally scheduled to be due on Thursday by class time, but I just extended it out until Friday by midnight. So you have a little bit more time to work on it. Part of the reason I did that is because we there was one more fallacy of relevance to cover on Thursday last week that we didn't get to, and that is the red herring. So I added some notes about red herring in that message that I sent to everybody, so that could help you if you wanted to try and get started on your work already. If not, we'll talk about it today, and you'll have all the information you need for that homework. So other than that, I also spent the weekend and part of yesterday working on the midterms and finishing those. So I've now graded those midterms. If and when you're ready for your score, just let me know. And whenever I see a person respond, give me an email. I'll respond within 48 hours to give you your grade back. Just do give me about 48 hours or so, give or take, just because I have a lot of messages coming in right now from all kinds of classes that I'm teaching. But not to worry. If you do send me such a message, then you're in line, and I'll get to you as soon as possible, and it won't take that long. So anyways, we're moving forward through the class. Once that second homework is back to me this Friday, or whenever you're ready to turn it in, we're going away for spring break after that. Then when we come back, the first meeting that we have when we return is actually scheduled as a quiz. It wasn't necessarily my intention to have a quiz on the first day back, but because of the dates of our schedule, there's no real way to arrange it differently. So just know that we will have a second quiz when we return from spring break, and that's going to be on chapter 5. It's going to have to do with all the different fallacies. So the homework assignment that you guys just have been given is only really related to the fallacies of relevance, those category which has 8 members within it. But the quiz that we will take when we return after the spring break, that'll have to do with all 20 fallacies from all 3 of the categories. So anyway, guys, thanks again. And as usual, yeah, thank you for being here. If you have a chance, make sure to leave a comment behind at some point just to keep a record of your attendance going. And it's always good to see all you guys. So, okay, what I guess I'll start off with here is just a little bit of a review of some of those fallacies of relevance that we covered last Thursday to just kind of bring us back onto the topic. And then I'm going to speak about the last one that we didn't cover, which is red herring. And then we will move into the third and final category of fallacies today, which is called fallacies of unwarranted assumption. Okay. So this part of the class is all dedicated to chapter 5. And chapter 5 is the chapter that deals with what are called fallacies. Fallacies are when an argument has a logical error or a flaw. And a fallacious argument, a fallacy, is a bad argument. It's an erroneous argument. When there's a fallacious argument, that means that the premises don't give the right kind of support to the conclusion, so it's not the right way to try and make the case for whatever the argument's conclusion is. And different fallacies have been identified and given names throughout the centuries, throughout the millennia. So we're learning what they are, and so we can point them out to people when they commit them, and that way we can also try and stop ourselves from lapsing into committing fallacies ourselves. So the first group of fallacies were the fallacies of ambiguity, and we talked about that a lot already, so I'm not going to go through a big detailed review of them. but the ambiguity fallacies included equivocation, fallacy of amphiboly, fallacy of accent, and then the fallacy of division and composition. So there were 5 of those. Then last meeting, it was all about those fallacies of relevance, which have to do with your homework as well. So there are 8 of them. And let me just go over them one by one with a quick description of each one. Okay, so the first fallacy of relevance that we learned about is called personal attack. It's also sometimes known as the ad hominem fallacy from its older kind of official Latin name. But anyway, what is personal attack fallacy? It's pretty straightforward. It's when a person, instead of responding to someone's argument with a logical counter-argument, attacking the person who presented the argument to them. So somebody says something that you don't agree with, but instead of trying to show why they're wrong, you just make it personal. Like if somebody said to you that greenhouse gases are a result of man-made industrial processes, and therefore we should try and curb those processes because it's causing the planet to warm up too much. Someone responds back to that by saying, no way, my friend, because, you know, I heard that, you know, your mom got a DUI at one time, so I would never listen to anything you say. That's personal, right? It has nothing to do with the argument the person gave. It's just trying to level a personal attack and insult, and that's just one option. I mean, you could have just called the person ugly or said that their breath smells or that, you know, they don't know how to throw a baseball. There's a lot of things you could say to a person that are just not relevant to their argument. So when you don't like a person's conclusion, then the only way to logically reply is to try and dispute their evidence or to provide counter evidence that undermines the reasoning they've got. But you can't just make it into some type of personal attack. So if you say to somebody, oh, well, of course you're going to say something like that because the way you look or your circumstances, then you're abusing the person or attacking them, and that's not really a way of rationally arguing. One example in the book was like, Raul gives a logical reasoning-based argument for the policy of affirmative action, and someone reports back to them, well, you're Hispanic, so I'm not going to listen to you when you talk about affirmative action. But that's making it personal again. Once more, you're supposed to not take any measure of the person who's giving the argument and reply to the argument directly itself as though it's just something that you encountered in writing. Okay, so anyway, that's one of them. And then next is appeal to force. Sometimes people call that the scare tactic fallacy. That's basically when you want to get someone to change their mind or their view, so you try and threaten them or you even use force itself. So again, it's when you use or threaten to use force, whether physical, legal, or emotional, to get someone to change their view or to back down and accept your position. So like if you're talking to your boss about a position or a political idea or a moral debate, and they don't agree with you, like you say, you know, I think a woman has a right to choose because it's a constitutionally protected right, and you know, women are the one that have to bear the fetus, so they should make the decision. And your boss says, well, you know, I don't agree with you, my friend, and you better change your mind because around here, at this workplace, we don't say those things. We don't believe those things. Now, is the person really giving you some kind of rational argument why you're wrong? Or are they trying to appeal to like what it is to be a person with a human right to life? No, they're just saying basically change your mind or else. So that's kind of how the scare tactic fallacy works. There's this implied use or actual threat of the use of force. And the format of such argument is stop saying that, don't believe that, change your position to mine, or else, and then you can fill in the blank, whatever that or else could be. All right, it's not a good way to argue. When you want someone to agree with something you're saying or your own view, you have to make a rational case about it based on evidence. You can't just say, I'm going to intimidate and dominate you into holding my own position. Why would that even be satisfying anyway? If someone is just backing down from their own view out of fear, that doesn't mean that they really agree with you anyway. It just means that you've effectively held leverage over them so that they don't feel comfortable telling you what they really think. Okay, so next there's appeal to pity. That's when you invoke sympathy or pity in an argument when it's not relevant to the circumstances or to the conclusion. There are many cases given in the book of like the traffic stop. That's one easy example. Someone's pulled over and cited for speeding, and they start to ask the officer for special treatment because of a weak excuse that's based on pity. Like, I just saw a sad movie, or I had a fight with my partner, or, you know, I just learned that I didn't get this job that I applied for, so maybe you could just throw me a break and give me a warning. Anyway, whether it's in school or when you're dealing with the law or with authority figures, parents, whoever, It's best for you to try and make rational arguments that don't rely on another person showing sympathy or pity to you. Sometimes we see this in advertising and marketing as well. Buy this product because here's some kind of sad story that maybe if you don't address the needs of these people that are mentioned in the story, then you're doing something wrong, and buying our product helps serve that need. Okay, anyway, so then there's popular appeal, thinking that something's good or true or correct just because it's popular. So that's what popular appeal is, saying something is a given just because it's popular. So citing popular opinion as support for your argument or for your claim. A lot of times popular things are not the best. It just depends. But if they're good and if they're willing, if they're worthy of such praise or support, then you should be able to formulate a rational argument that just speaks to the value of a thing directly without mentioning that it's popular. So like, for example, if the iPhone is better than Android because more people own it, well, you shouldn't just say it's because more people own it. Why is it that more people own it? What is it about it that has earned it this status of having greater appeal? You know, so you wouldn't just say, oh, it's the best phone because it's the one that most people own. You talk about its camera, you talk about its interface, you talk about its apps, et cetera, et cetera. So anyway, the right way to argue that something's good or true or correct is to directly support it with evidence rather than to just say it's popular. Of course, at some time periods in history, slavery was popular, or not allowing women to vote, or, you know, you can imagine the list goes on. So we owe it to ourselves to make a more rational appeal to the value or whatever, truth of something. Okay, so then there's appeal to, one other thing about popular appeal though, before I move on too fast, sometimes we see it in advertising and marketing when just a popular endorsement sponsor is the basis for the sales pitch. Like, buy it just because Tom Brady's in the commercial, or buy it just because you can see Ronaldo or somebody, you know, in the commercial. So whether something's good for you or worthy of your purchase depends on the value and its features itself of the product, not just the popularity of the sponsor. Okay, then there's appeal to ignorance. That's when you think or claim that something's true just because no one's proven that it's false. Obviously, when you make a claim that something's true, you need evidence to support it. You can't just say that no one's proven otherwise. I can't stand here in front of you guys and say aliens must exist out there in outer space because no one's been able to prove prove otherwise. Or I think that, you know, you stole something from me because you can't prove otherwise. Like, I'm putting the burden of proof on you. When you have evidence for something, it has to be supporting evidence that's confirming evidence, not just the absence of contrary evidence. So when a person tries to make an argument based on the lack of evidence that it's false, that's not the right type of argument to make. It's based on ignorance of the contrary. Okay, so then there's hasty generalization. That's when someone jumps to a universal conclusion off of a sample size that's too small or that's not fully representative. Like if a person had a couple of experiences with, I don't know. Okay, so Violetta, you have a question. If a celebrity is in a commercial, do most of them actually use the product, or are they just there for advertising purposes? Well, Violetta, I mean, it does depend, but usually I would say that it doesn't have anything to do with the celebrity or popular figure's actual product use. In many cases, they are just given, you know, a certain financial incentive to appear in the commercial. So, you know, these are all negotiated by way of contracts. It costs a lot of money to secure an appearance by a celebrity figure and to get their time on set. So they're not doing these things for free. They're well compensated, and so the sponsorship agreement, you know, that's what obligates them or incentivizes them to show their face or their likeness or their name in such commercials. I'm not going to say that it's never the case that they use the product. I mean, you'd like to hope that in some cases they found favor with the product and therefore they're an even better and more, I guess, authentic sponsor because they can speak from their own experience. But it's not to be assumed as a general matter. Like, so if you see Shaq up there showing you icy hot or whatever, not necessarily. I mean, this guy is extremely wealthy, so I'm sure that if he really wants to have any kind of physical therapy, he could go to a masseuse and he can, you know, get all kinds of very precise treatments. But yeah, it's good to have healthy skepticism. So I would say, on balance, usually they probably don't use those products. But anyway, let's continue. Very good question. Hasty generalization, as I was trying to say, is just when a person jumps to a universal conclusion, but only based on a sample that's too small Thank you, Violetta. Or is not representative. Yeah. So, like, if I don't know, if I had a girlfriend that cheated on me, and I remember that back as a kid, my mom cheated on my dad or something. Not true about me, okay? But just suppose that happened to somebody. Two experiences, and then they just generalize, universal generalization. All women are unfaithful, or women are not loyal, right? Just because of two example cases. That's not enough experience to make a claim about all women, nor would it be enough experience to make a similar claim about all types of men, right? So when you make a universal claim, there has to be extremely very strong evidence with no counterexamples to it. So when we think in terms of stereotypes based on limited experience or evidence, that's when we make hasty generalizations. And that's a problem in life. So make sure that you check yourself before you go out and say, oh, all of these things are a certain way, especially if you don't have enough evidence to support that kind of claim. Okay, then there's straw man. Okay, and this kind of gets us close to where we ended last time. As we begin today's meeting, everyone, I'm just reviewing the material of last lecture. But we're almost done with that. So there was straw man. Now, what is straw man? Straw man is when you take your opponent's real argument, but then you distort it and misrepresent it so that it sounds much worse than it actually was. Like if a person said, I think that the way we grow genetically modified crops has to be modified or changed because there are more ecologically sustainable and perhaps healthier methods of agricultural production than genetically modified crops. And now their opponent comes back and misrepresents what they said. So like their response is this: oh, come on, are you serious? You really think that we should no longer have farming? How can we possibly feed ourselves if we don't have farming? I mean, then there won't be fruits and vegetables. What are we supposed to do? Just live off of sand or something? So come on, that's a crazy argument. But did the person in the first place say no one should farm? No. They just said that there's one particular method of farming that we should perhaps modify or adjust, which doesn't sound so unreasonable or extreme. But in replying to the person, our opponent has taken the real view and distorted it out of bounds. So sometimes people do that. They want to challenge your opinion or your argument so badly that they mischaracterize it. And then that's when they've done this straw man. Somebody says, I don't know, a man and a woman should be able to get married, but also people of the same sex should be able to get married. People should be able to make their own choices about who they get married to, because it's all about who you love and people have their freedoms. What do you think? And someone says back to them, well, I think it's insane for you to tell me that men and women shouldn't be allowed to marry anymore. I mean, what? Then traditional form of heterosexual monogamy is just going to get ruled out? Or how is that the way to go into the future? That's a time-honored institution. So if we don't allow men and women to have opposite-sex marriage, I think our society is going to collapse. Now, did the person really say that, though? Oh, let's ban the traditional opposite-sex unions? No, they just said let's make space for people to marry that are of the same sex, that are gay or whatever. So that would be taking the actual argument, distorting it, misrepresenting it to make it sound extreme, radical, ill-advised, or whatever. So sometimes that happens to you. You make an argument to somebody, and then they come back at you with a worse version of your argument than what you really did say. And so if that ever happens, then you just have to kind of check the person and say, that's a straw man. I mean, you're attacking a straw man. I didn't say that. So make sure that people understand your arguments correctly and that they don't run off with the wrong version of it to make you sound worse. Okay, and you kind of try not to do that yourself too, right? You want to take your opponent charitably is the word. You want to try and understand them in the best way that they must have intended. So that way, when you do criticize their argument, if you do, you're criticizing the real argument and not this other one. That is a distortion of what they said. Okay, so finally, now maybe some of you guys had a chance to look at the notes that I sent when I gave you instructions on the upcoming homework assignment that's due Friday. Because at the bottom of that, I showed a little brief discussion of the of the red herring fallacy that we're going to talk about now. So there's one more, and that's what we didn't cover last time. So last fallacy of relevance is called red herring. So red herring is a fallacy that happens when you basically try to distract from the main topic that you're already discussing. So it happens when somebody distracts an argument by bringing up an unrelated separate issue or separate topic. Okay, so let's see here. So sidetracking an argument. By bringing up a different, unrelated topic or issue. Red herring, sidetracking an argument by bringing up a different and unrelated topic. So like suppose that somebody is going to drink and drive. And you tell the person, you give them a reasonable argument as to why that's not a good idea. You say, well, come on, really, you shouldn't drink and drive. There's obvious reasons why not. When you're behind the wheel drunk, you might not be able to control the vehicle. You might get into an accident, cause harm for yourself, for other people, damage the vehicle, get into legal trouble. It's not worth it. Just wait until you get sober or call an Uber or a Lyft or just stay at that place. That'd be the best call for you. So that's my argument. Now, suppose the person comes back and says, ha ha, come on, are you serious? Don't tell me that I'm not supposed to drink and drive. I mean, just look, do you see how many people out there are texting and driving? How many people are out there using their phone, calling people while they're driving? So those are distracted drivers. That's fine. Why? So don't tell me that I shouldn't drink and drive. Now, is that a good response? It's not, because what did they say in response? Did they give any reasonable argument as to why drinking and driving is safe, or why drinking and driving is not problematic, or why there's no risks? They didn't. Instead, they just said there are other things that people can also do while they're driving, which are equally capable of causing harm and injury, but that doesn't excuse their own behavior, and it doesn't show that what they did is safe or secure. So it's a red herring. They're trying to change the topic to something else. Well, you think this is bad. It's not, because here's something else people could do. That's totally a distraction away from the main topic. It would be like if someone slapped you on the street, and you're like, what are you doing? You have no right to slap me. That's assault. And they say to you, come on, don't complain. I mean, don't you know some people will just shoot you on the street that don't even know you? I mean, so how can you really complain about a slap? Well, okay, yeah, it's also wrong to murder people with a gun or whatever, and we know that. But that doesn't excuse other forms of violence that are less than that, and that's just changing the topic. So once again, it's a red herring. Let me think. We see this sometimes in politics. So in political figures, sometimes they're challenged to answer a question, like say in a debate. And instead of giving a direct answer or replying to someone's position, they'll just raise a red herring by mentioning something that somebody else did that's not part of the question. So like, what if somebody says, don't you think that it's an obligation that you have to the American people to speak about your tax filings? You know, don't you think if you're going to run for high office, we should have access to your tax filings? Because it's important, if we're going to make decisions about you as our leader, we want to know what your financial entanglements may be. And the person can say back, oh, come on, I don't need to do that, because have you really looked at my opponent? You know, my opponent has all kinds of scandals going back decades. My opponent, you know, has a charity that they established a long time ago that has some questionable funds. So that's what I think is the real issue. But hold on. Maybe there are issues and questions that should be asked of the person's opponent, whoever they may be. But that's changing the topic again, and it's trying to sidetrack away from the main thing that we were asking, which is what about you, right? So if I say to you, you know, your record in school because you've plagiarized is a terrible thing, plagiarism is wrong, and then you come back to me and you say, oh, but come on, don't you know that some people, they don't even go to college and they just commit crimes, so don't tell me it's wrong to plagiarize. Well, it's also wrong to go and commit crimes and not even be in, I mean, people are free to not be in school, no issues with that, but if you want to, you know, commit crime and stuff, that's definitely wrong, but that doesn't excuse people in school for committing plagiarism either. So it's a totally separate issue, and it's a distraction. Now, the book has some additional examples. Like they say, okay, well, what about in the United States, our criminal justice system? We incarcerate so many people. We have a mass incarceration problem. You could argue, you know, in the first world, we have some of the highest incarceration rates. So if we're this beacon of freedom and liberty, how come so many people are sitting in jail? And then somebody says, oh, come on, don't tell me we have a problem in America, because don't you see in other countries, in some places, they don't even have freedom of the press, and they don't even have freedom of speech. If you go out there and you try to protest, they're just going to throw you in jail or maybe even execute you. I mean, try protesting in North Korea and see what happens. So don't tell me we have problems in our system with the criminal justice problems. if other countries don't even allow peaceful assembly. Well, yeah, other countries are perhaps deficient in their obligations to the people, but that doesn't somehow excuse bad behavior or bad policy on our side. So if you say, look over there, what about those guys and what they do? You know, there's torture chambers being run in prisons in some parts of the world. In our country, you know, people complain about prison conditions. It doesn't excuse our behavior or our policy deficiencies to point out the shortcomings and shortfalls of others. So why do they call it red herring? That's the last thing I wanted to mention. The name red herring comes from a practice to train hunting dogs. Okay, so suppose you're a hunter, right? You go out, you hunt, you have dogs with you, bloodhounds and stuff. And these dogs are supposed to try and retrieve the fallen prey that you've shot in the field. So say you shot like a pheasant from 400 yards away, whatever, and you hit him, you got a direct hit, bird falls to the ground. Now the dog needs to run over there, retrieve it, and bring it back to you. Well, one thing they would do to train these dogs up and make them really good at that is they would bring these herrings out as part of this routine. So what is a herring? A herring is actually a little fish, a very smelly little fish. So a red herring is a smelly fish. And what they would do is they would place these herrings along tangents, diagonal away from the direct line forward to the target of the bloodhound. And why they would do that is because they would try to distract the dog with the scent, because it's so powerful in smell that if the dog wasn't very well trained by the hunter, then instead of going and, let's say, retrieving that pheasant that has been shot that's laying down ahead, it would get distracted by the herring off to the side and its powerful smell and go towards it, so it gets knocked off target by the red herring. And but when they're very well trained, then they don't get distracted by these little smelly herrings, and they stay focused on the original target. So in life, when you're dealing with people and you're exchanging views and having arguments about whatever the case is, then you have to try and not get distracted by the red herrings that the person drops when they try and sidetrack you away from the main topic of conversation. So if you were talking about the problems of climate change and they say, but come on, don't you think that that immigration is a bigger problem? You could say, well, we could deal with that one thing at a time, you know, but we're having one conversation topic right now, and you can't defuse my point or say that it's wrong just because there's something else that we could address instead. So don't get distracted. Don't take the bait of the red herring. If you're the hunting dog, stay focused on the original target. And if you're a human being engaged in argument or dialogue, don't get thrown off the track by the red herring tactic. Okay, so that's everything that I wanted to cover from those fallacies of relevance. I spent the first about 25 minutes today doing that because it's important for your second homework. Now that you have all that information, you're fully set for your homework if you weren't already, because the homework assignment, it just deals with the fallacies of relevance. So the assigned pages, if you're working on it, it's page 159 and 60 in 5th edition. If you're a person that has the 4th edition, it's page 151 and 152. But there's just a list of 26 argument examples, and in each one, there's a different fallacy. Well, there's some fallacy of relevance. Or the answer is no fallacy. So your 9 optional responses for any question are personal attack, appeal to force, popular appeal, appeal to pity, appeal to ignorance, hasty generalization, straw man, red herring, or no fallacy. So one of those 9 terms is the answer to each of the 26 questions. And all you have to do to complete that homework, you don't have to write the full argument out again. In this case, all I'm asking you for is the name of the relevance fallacy in each case. Okay, so that's due to me by Friday by midnight. And whenever you send it in, I'll grade it right away and we'll be good to go. Okay then, so we're continuing on. One last group of fallacies then. And we have 2 meetings obviously this week. We have today and Thursday. So we've got plenty of time to finish this category. So there's no rush and there's no worries about that. So here it is, the last group. They're called fallacies of unwarranted assumption. Okay, fallacies of unwarranted assumption. And as with the other 2 categories, this is a category name. And within the category, members fall. It's just like, you know, the category of mammal has many different members: horses, dogs, cats, human beings. within each of the categories, we've seen there are different members. In the category fallacy of ambiguity, there were 5 members. Fallacy of relevance, 8 members. And the fallacies of unwarranted assumption, there are 7 of these. But what is the overall definition of the category? Well, here's what it is. So fallacies of unwarranted assumption happen when an argument includes some assumptions that are not supported by evidence. Okay, so when an argument includes an assumption, or assumptions plural, but I'll just put it singular for the moment. When an argument includes an assumption that is not supported by evidence. Okay, so that's what fallacies of unwarranted assumption are. Arguments where there's assumptions built into the argument, but the assumptions are exactly that. They're just assumed. They're not supported by evidence that you actually have. And that makes the argument weak. So you have to make sure that you don't assume things in the course of an argument, which there's no evidence to show or prove. And there are 7 different fallacies of unwarranted assumptions. So now that we see the definition here, I'm going to clear that, and I'm going to list the names of the 7, and then we'll go through them as many as we can, one by one. So you see it, fallacies of unwarranted assumption, when an argument includes an assumption that's not supported by evidence. And what are the members of this family? Okay. So there are these members. You've got begging the question. Okay, and you've got inappropriate appeal to authority. That's not going to fit, sorry. Authority. Okay, next up we have loaded question. Then there's false dilemma. Okay, then we have questionable cause. Questionable cause. And then 2 more, there's slippery slope, and then the naturalistic fallacy. And yeah, the one more, maybe it's a little low on the board, so I'm going to just clear the top. The last one, naturalistic fallacy. Okay, so here we have 7 different fallacies of unwarranted assumption. Begging the question, inappropriate appeal to authority, loaded question, false dilemma, questionable cause, slippery slope, and then the naturalistic fallacy. So with these 7 items, we will be completing our fallacy topic in this semester. So there's 20 in total that we're learning. 5 ambiguity plus 8 relevance, that gets us to 13, plus 7 here of the of the unwarranted assumption fallacies. So since this was the first one listed, we'll start here with begging the question, and then we'll just go through as many of the others as we can today. So let's go through that one, begging the question fallacy. Okay, so with begging the question, the problem here in this fallacy is that one of the premises within the argument is the same as the conclusion, but it's just slightly changed in the wording. So this is essentially when one of the premises of the argument is just a reworded version of the conclusion. Okay? Reworded version of the conclusion. Okay, begging the question. When one of the premises in the argument is simply just a reworded version of the conclusion. Reworded, not rewarded, okay? Reworded, like the wording is just slightly adjusted, but it's the same concept. So that's not okay, because when you have a begging the question fallacy, the premise is identical to the conclusion. Now think about what premises and conclusions actually are. The conclusion, as you know, is the statement that you're trying to prove to be true. The premises are supposed to be the evidence that backs that conclusion up, that supports it. But how can the evidence be the same thing as the conclusion? Like if I asked you, say that someone claims the world is flat, and I say to them, well, what is your argument? And they say, okay, well, here's the argument. It's flat because it's definitely flat. Therefore, it's flat. That's not a good argument, because the person hasn't given any reason as to why they think it is flat. They've simply said it is because it is. And evidence has to be something that is independent and different from the conclusion that it's supposed to support. So that's not a good argument. Sometimes people call begging the question fallacy, they also have a separate name for it, of circular argument. Now why do some call it the circular argument fallacy? Because it goes in a circle. The evidence is the same as the conclusion, which is the same as the evidence. So it's kind of like a dog chasing its tail. The evidence is itself the same thing that is supposed to be supported by the evidence, and that's just not okay. Like here's some examples that I saw from the book that we can discuss. So take a look at this example here. Suppose we have this argument, simply one premise, and then the conclusion, and it says this. So the conclusion, let's say, is that capital punishment is wrong. So the conclusion of the argument is that capital punishment is wrong. That's what's being defended by the argument. And so you may ask, well, what is the reason then? And what's the overall evidence for that? And someone says, okay, well, let me tell you why capital punishment is wrong. Capital punishment is wrong, and here is the reason. The premise is that it's wrong because it's immoral for the state to impose death as a penalty. So it is immoral for the state to impose death as a penalty. But okay, let's look at this argument for a moment and just kind of examine it in a little more depth. So the argument is that it is immoral for the state to impose death as a penalty, and therefore capital punishment is wrong. But what is a different way of wording the concept of capital punishment? Capital punishment is one way to say it, but capital punishment is just the same thing as what? What is it exactly? So let me know that in the chat real fast, because we're learning about this begging the question fallacy. So this is one example the book gives, and I'm using it to help you understand. So saying capital punishment is wrong is the conclusion. But capital punishment can otherwise be referred to, in other words, as what? Hopefully we know this, but if not, we'll learn. Either way, though, it's going to come out. So what does someone know capital punishment to be? It is the death penalty, Gabriel, yes. So capital punishment is just a little more of a formal title for when death is extended as a penalty by the state. So this says it's immoral for the state to impose death as a penalty. But when the state is death as a penalty, that is capital punishment. So what's another way of saying that something is wrong? What is a synonym? A synonym, meaning the same thing but in a different word, for the concept of wrong. If I say that something is wrong to do, this is basically equivalent or equal to saying that it is what to do it. So very good, guys. Death penalty is capital punishment, right? But saying something's wrong could otherwise be labeled with what other type of term or terminology? Immoral, that's right. To say something's wrong is to say it's not okay, it's not right, it's immoral. So what this is overall saying, when you actually like kind of decode the language a little bit, is that The death penalty is wrong, therefore the death penalty is wrong. That's a circular argument. That's an argument where the conclusion is the premise. So there's no difference between the evidence that you're giving and the claim that you're supposed to prop up with the evidence. That's why it's begging the question. Begging the question, like the question still could be asked, why though is it wrong? And if you don't say anything other than just because, then the question still remains and it hasn't yet been answered. So we are begging yet again the answer to the question, since the premise is not different from the conclusion. Okay, now, could there be a rational argument that capital punishment is wrong? Yes, there definitely could be, and there are. Some people don't support the death penalty, and they may have valid reasons for that. Like Governor Gavin Newsom, for example, and even President Biden, on policy grounds, would like to repeal the death penalty. And in California, there's been a moratorium placed on it because Governor Gavin Newsom opposes the death penalty. But why? You could argue, oh, it doesn't have a deterrent effect. Or you could say that the dignity of human nature is such that we shouldn't execute people. Or you could argue that it may actually create a more violent society by normalizing, killing. So there's other reasons you could give as to why it's wrong, but just saying it's wrong because it's wrong doesn't offer a substantive reason. So it's a begging the question argument. Okay, let's continue, and we'll develop a few more examples like that so you understand it clearly. Okay, so like what if somebody says, another example, so like their conclusion is that abortion is immoral, and you ask why do you have that view and what is the reasoning behind it? And someone says, well, I'll tell you, I think it's immoral, and the reason is because to terminate a pregnancy is just not right. It's not right. To terminate a pregnancy. Okay, so abortion is just a word that refers to terminating a pregnancy, to induce the end of the pregnancy artificially. So abortion, terminating pregnancy. Saying something's immoral, basically the same as saying it's not right. So in this case, the argument is abortion's not right because it's just not right. And that's, again, it's a circular argument where the premise is the same as the conclusion. And we could have had the same kind of argument to the other conclusion too. Someone could have said abortion's not wrong, and then the premise could have been because it is permissible to terminate a pregnancy. So anyway, in either case, it would have been a circular argument. Now, could there be a good and valid argument that abortion is wrong or that it's not wrong? Sure. Some people will argue having to do with the status of the fetus, whether you have a right to life at the moment of conception or not, or when you have a full set of genetic material from both parents. There are arguments, and some people study these arguments in moral philosophy, but in this case, we have a circular argument because the premise, again, offers us nothing that's different from the conclusion. Okay, and one more from the book. It's always good, I think, to mention those examples from the book because they're pretty clear usually. How about this one? This one might take a moment for you to understand, but let's just put it here. So the first premise, let's say, claims that, well, overall, the conclusion of the argument is going to be that God exists. The first premise, God wrote the Bible. And the second premise, the Bible says God exists. So therefore, the conclusion of the argument, God exists. Now, this argument, can you tell me which of the two premises already assumes that the conclusion is true? So like this conclusion that God exists has already been assumed in one of those two premises. Which one? Number 1 or 2, if you look at it, is already assuming that God exists, which it shouldn't assume because that's what's to be proved in the conclusion. So that would make it circular. But question then, guys, let me know if you see the argument on the board. Which premise there contains an assumption that there is a God, that he exists? That's right, Nicole. Yes, it's number one. Because what does number one say? It says that God wrote the Bible. But to write the Bible, obviously that assumes that the being exists, because you can't write something if you don't exist. So this argument begins with the assumption of God's existence and then concludes based on this assumption that God exists. So it's like God existed and therefore God exists. Now, again, no problem with the argument that God exists. There are many solid arguments for that conclusion, and those are also well known in philosophy historically. You've got the cosmological argument that says the universe can't come from nothing. You've got the design argument that says that complicated things that have a function, like even the eye, on comparison with the watch, they have to have a designer. There is the ontological argument, and that's just the tip of the iceberg. There's many, interesting and detailed arguments that try to prove God exists. But in this case anyway, the argument is circular because the first premise already makes that assumption to begin with. So that's what I can tell you guys about begging the question. Sometimes it's frustrating because if you fail to recognize that there's this circularity in the argument, it can be hard to disprove the conclusion. But if you think an argument contains this fallacy, maybe the best thing to do is write out the argument in standard form and then look at the premises, compare them to the conclusion, and see if any of them are simply a sneaky way of rewording or slightly altering the language but making the same claim as the conclusion does. Okay, so that's begging the question. And now that we've got that, let me give you one more as I'm erasing it. What if I tell you that the Lakers are the best team in, let me change the example. I'd say the Tampa Bay Buccaneers are the best team in football. And someone says to me, okay, well, it's like a sports argument, sports debate. Someone else is like, well, interesting argument, but let me hear your reasons. Why do you think that Tampa Bay is the best? And what if I gave them this as my argument? Okay, you want to know? I think they're the best because if you compare them to all the other teams in the whole league, the other teams are all inferior. So that's why they are the best. But what did I just say as the reason? I said Tampa Bay is the best because all other teams in the NFL are inferior to them. But to say that all the other teams are inferior just means that they're not as good as the Buccaneers. And so that's essentially just equivalent to saying they're the best because they are the best. You can't make that argument. You have to say why they're the best by giving reasons that don't just amount to the same claim. So you could say because they just won the Super Bowl, or you could say because they have a great offense or whatever. And you could give statistics, reasons, etc. towards that conclusion. But you couldn't just say they're the best because no other team is as good. Okay. So let's continue then. Inappropriate appeal to authority, that's next. Inappropriate appeal to authority. So this fallacy happens when we appeal to the viewpoint of someone that we take to be an authority as support for our argument. But the problem is that this person is not an authority in that field. Okay, so when we cite the view of, and now I'm putting authority in quotes because it's like, this is not, it's like a false authority, but when we cite the view of an authority to support our claim, but, and here's the problem, but this person is not an authority on this subject. Okay, so sometimes people try to defend their viewpoints by saying, well, this isn't just me, here's this other person who agrees with that and also thinks the same thing. So like you refer to the viewpoint of another one as evidence that you're correct. And that could be fine and relevant and valid if the person is a real authority on the subject matter. But if they're not, then when you cite their view, you're citing an inappropriate type of authority. Like the textbook gives this example. Say that someone's priest told them that genetic engineering isn't safe. So it's not safe, and why not? You ask them, oh, because my priest told me that. Well, the problem about that is that a priest has certain kind of knowledge and expertise, and they're very authoritative when it comes to matters concerning theology and scripture and the history of the church. So if you wanted to go to some authoritative figure and ask them, well, what caused, the Protestant Reformation, or what caused the schism in Eastern Orthodox Christianity and Catholicism, that person, this church scholar, this priest, could tell you probably about that stuff with clear authority. But they're out of their depth, perhaps, in a scientific discussion of genetic engineering. So it's not the right kind of person to cite, and that's what the book says. It says, unless your priest also happens to be an expert in genetic engineering, before accepting his argument as correct, you should ask them for reliable and authoritative evidence for their assertion. So sometimes because people are authorities or experts in one field, the mistaken view that some have is that we could cite their viewpoint in any area as credible evidence. Me, for example, I'm a philosophy professor. You guys know that. So I'm quite well versed in logic, philosophy, the history of Western philosophy and thought. But I don't know a lot of things about some other topics, right? I was very bad in school at chemistry. That was my worst subject ever back in high school. And so if you say to someone, Dr. Vulich, I was listening to him today, and Dr. Vulich said that helium is probably the heaviest of the elements in the periodic table. I'm not the person to cite on that because I'm not a chemist and I'm not a chemistry expert, far from it. Even though I have the title of doctor, it doesn't give me the expertise and authority to speak on everything. So we see this sometimes, unfortunately, as we're dealing with the pandemic. Have you seen people who reject medical and technical expertise in favor of uninformed opinions that just come from random people that they hear speaking online? One case I can think of is Dr. Fauci, who is the leading infectious disease specialist at the CDC for generations now. He's telling us how to mitigate the threat of COVID and, the distance and mask up and all that stuff. But then you had this guy, Dr. Scott Atlas, who's a radiologist who is contradicting many of his public positions and saying, no, let's just let everyone mix together with no masks and get to herd immunity. That person, though, if you said, well, Dr. Atlas said something opposite to Fauci, so I'm going with him. This person has expertise, but in the wrong field, to be the kind of person whose viewpoints you should cite as such evidence. So sometimes also we see, and it's kind of a cousin to the popular appeal when you have a celebrity figure, but sometimes, you do have celebrities and people that are being endorsers of sponsorship and products, and they don't know anything about that type of product because it's not within their field of expertise. Like there's this famous physicist, Michio Kaku, who was really great with quantum physics, theoretical physics. He's kind of like a popular, like Tyson DeGrasse, Neil deGrasse Tyson type of guy, right? But he did some commercials a few years back for like a financial planning app. And the whole like slogan or sales pitch was, be smart, invest with this app. And he's like trying to tell you to buy it. But if you thought, oh, I'm going to buy this investment app because I saw this famous physicist was doing a commercial for it. Again, a physicist is a person who has a lot of knowledge about cosmology, the laws of physics, Einstein, Newton, Bohr, and these other guys. But it wouldn't be the first person I would think to ask if I was trying to lean on someone for financial planning advice and investment portfolio advice. That's a banker or a financial specialist that I would talk to in that case. So anyway, these are perhaps different examples of inappropriate appeal to authority. Think for yourself, and if you do cite authority, make sure it's the person that's in the correct field. Otherwise, it's an inappropriate appeal. Let me see if I have more from the book. We often find this fallacy in advertisements in which celebrities are used to promote a product. For example, Lady Gaga and Tony Bennett teamed up in a holiday ad for Barnes & Noble, while NBA star Blake Griffin appears in an ad for Kia cars. Olympic swimmer Michael Phelps appears in ads for milk. I've seen this recently. Have any of you guys seen these ads? Michael Phelps talking to you about like mental health and clinical psychology support. He's a professional swimmer, as you guys know, an Olympian athlete. And if I wanted to know anything about the backstroke or like how to prepare and train for elite swimming, that'd be a great authoritative source to go to. But talking about mental health and psychology of that kind, maybe he's not the first person I would have thought of. Okay, so anyway, guys, inappropriate appeal to. Hopefully that makes sense. And we can continue from there. So we've done 2 of our 7 fallacies of unwarranted assumption. And now we move to the third. Sorry, Peachy, here you go. That's loaded question, okay? Okay, so the loaded question fallacy. This is a fallacy that happens when we ask questions that assume things that we don't already know. So loaded question is whenever you ask a question that assumes the answer to a different question that you didn't ask. Okay, so they're kind of questions that have assumptions baked into them that you're not aware of. So loaded question. When you ask a question, I'll move Peachy after I get this definition up there, okay? But just let me put it here first. Peachy, though, can you kind of help me? Can we just set you down, girl? Yeah, maybe? No? Okay, well, she's just unruly. Going down here. Good girl. Loaded question. Okay. That assumes an answer to a different question that you didn't ask. So to a different, let's say, unasked question. Okay, so there we go, loaded question. When you ask a question that assumes an answer to a different question that you didn't ask. Okay, so question that assumes an answer to a different unasked question. Okay, so these are basically fallacies that occur in the context of questions being asked. And let's see if you can spot the hidden assumption of some of these loaded questions that I'm going to now pose to you. Okay, so what if someone just asks you and they don't know you like that, but they just ask you this question? Let me think. Who are you dating right now? So who are you with? Who are you dating? How's that a loaded question? What's being assumed in the way that question is asked? Something's being assumed that maybe a person might not know about the one that they're asking this to. So someone just simply asks straight up, who are you dating? That could be assuming that you're dating someone at all, right, Ghazi? And the question then is just tell me the identity. But if you're not dating anyone, then you can't give a straight answer, right? You can't tell someone a name if there's no such person. So instead, you'd have to correct the questioner, and you'd have to say, well, I'm sorry, actually, that question is assuming I'm dating somebody, but actually I'm not. So it's a loaded question. I can't answer it. I have to change the format of the question, actually. And that's how loaded questions go. Something's being assumed in the way the question is asked. What if someone, like in the court of law, so sometimes you might be asked leading questions by the lawyer or the attorney or by the judge or officer. So like, what if they say to you, and you've pled not guilty, right? You said you're innocent. And they get up there and they say, come on, just tell us, why did you do it? You know, why did you kill the person? Let's just hear it. Just give us the motive. We want to know. Tell us all for the first time why you did it. Now, how could that be a loaded question? Because it assumes guilt, and it's only asking for motive behind doing the deed. But if the person claims innocence, then they can't tell you motive because they say they didn't do it in the first place. So that would be another loaded question, I guess. Nowadays, you know, when it comes to gender, a lot of people talk about assuming someone's gender, right? I guess that could be somewhat in the ballpark of loaded question. Like if somebody asks you, do you identify as male or female? Is that a loaded question? I think it could be, I guess, because some would argue that there are ways of identifying that are neither, right? That are different gender from either category or agender, right? So in some case, we might say that that assumes the person is just one of two possible categories where there are more. Other loaded questions, let's see. This was a pretty embarrassing one, but it actually happened in real life, so it's like a funny anecdote. When I was a little kid, just hanging out with one of my friends at their house, you know, their parents were hanging out with us and like serving us cookies and stuff. So all these little kids were chilling, and then this kid's mom that we were hanging out at their pad, she came down, and one of our friends saw her and didn't really know her, and just looking at her, asked spontaneously. So it was a little kid asking his mom, "Oh wow, you're pregnant. When is the baby due?" And so the question is, when is your baby due? But actually, she was not pregnant. That's just her body, you know, the way she looked. So that's an embarrassing loaded question, because instead of saying the date or the time frame, she had to say, no, I'm not pregnant. So that's a weird question and an awkward question to ask me. Okay, so that's again the case of a loaded question. Make sure then that when you ask people questions of whatever type, that you're in position to know all the information that you're assuming in the question itself. Otherwise, you might find yourself in such a position to ask a loaded question. And when other people ask loaded questions to you, you sometimes have to just gently correct the format of question. And you have to say, well, no, you're assuming something there that's not really the case. In the book, they offer this as another interesting example. So suppose someone's asking you about the death penalty and they say, what do you think about it? Do you think that it should just be for people that are older than 18? Now, how is that a loaded question? If someone asks you whether you think that it should be only for those individuals that are 18 and up or not. So if they ask you if you think it should be limited to those that are over 18, what is being assumed in the question, you think? Do you think the death penalty should be for just people over 18? What's being assumed in this question? Just to try and test your knowledge about the current concept. Just kind of, I'd like to take a moment with you guys to sort of check in on everything. Okay, not yet though, I'm still waiting for your response. You heard the example though, right? Do you think this death penalty should just be for people over 18? Right, Gabriel, it assumes that the person is in support of the death penalty in the first place. And then the question is just, at what age do you think eligibility should kick in? 18 and above, or even less? But if a person doesn't support the death penalty at all, zero, like they don't think it should even exist as a penalty, then they wouldn't be able to answer at what age they think that it should be a valid penalty that you can apply in the law. Or what if a person asks you, who did you vote for in the last election? That assumes that you did vote, and it's just a question of which identity was your choice. Okay, now here's one more, and I'll just leave it at this. Sometimes even in relationships, we ask people loaded questions that assume things that we're not necessarily aware of. Maybe this has happened to you, or you can just imagine, but suppose that someone asks you simply this. Hey, what's wrong? What's wrong? Tell me what's wrong. How could that be a loaded question? The simple question, what is wrong? What's the assumption there? Maybe, in some situations anyway, one's assuming by asking this, what thing? The straightforward question, what's wrong, makes what assumption? That something is wrong, okay, and they just need to know what it is. But sometimes maybe nothing is wrong at all, and it really puts you in an awkward spot when there isn't anything wrong and someone asks you this. Now it's like you have to convince the person, no, there's no problem and nothing is wrong, so the question itself is misplaced. Because sometimes people do assume things and then they ask questions based on the assumption, but it's better for you to wait until you have all the proper information to proceed further in a line of questioning. So get the facts clear and then take it step by step. Okay, guys, so there you go. Loaded question, yet another fallacy of unwarranted assumption. So we've now covered, I guess, 3. We've covered the begging the question, inappropriate appeal to authority, and then there's the loaded question fallacy. So I think we can at least finish with one more today, and that's going to be false dilemma. Okay, so the false dilemma fallacy, sometimes it's got a few other names too. I've heard it referred to alternatively as the false choice fallacy, fallacy of false choice. Sometimes people call it the fallacy of a false dichotomy, but we'll just stick with false dilemma since that's what's used in this book. So false dilemma happens when a person reduces the responses to a complex issue to a simple binary either-or choice. So it makes something where there are more than 2 possible options or choices seem as though there's only those 2. And that's why they call it false dilemma, false choice. It's like a false restriction of options down to just 2, when in fact there are more than those 2. But anyway, let me put it here and then we'll talk about it. So when one reduces the responses to a complex issue to a binary either-or choice. False dilemma. So there it is. When you reduce the responses to a complex issue to a oversimplified binary either or choice. Okay, so, well, what if somebody asks you like a question and it puts you on the spot because it limits you to two polarized choices, but you feel like there are more than those two choices? Like, what if somebody says to you this, where do you stand politically? Like, are you a Republican or a Democrat? Which of the two parties are you in? Now, how is that a false dilemma? It reduces this political identification to two choices, right? But is that fair or not? What do you think? So if a person constrains you and tries to put you in that box saying, which one, Republican or Democrat? You could say, well, it is a false dilemma because why? Just if I could see from you, so make sure it's coming through, this idea. How could it be a false dilemma? Or is that really just the only two possibilities? Yeah, there are more than two parties, and there's also the option to not be affiliated with either party. Like, so you can be a member of a third party, Green Party, Peace and Freedom Party, Libertarian Party, or you could be declined to state. Me personally, I'm declined to state, just so that you know. I mean, I've always been unaffiliated with either of the two major political parties. I mean, I have my own voting habits, but I don't assign myself a political identity as Republican or Democrat. So if I was asked the question, I would have to say it is a false dilemma. And sometimes people even take the extreme opposites or options to be even more polarized. Like, oh, are you a hardcore left-wing socialist? Are you like a right-wing nationalist? Where are you? But the political spectrum, as you guys know, has all kinds of shades of gray in between. And so that would be a false dilemma. What if somebody, I mean, and also we talked about gender, so are you a man or are you a woman? There are some of those people and folks out there that, they stand on their conviction that they think there's just these two gender categories, but many people assign to themselves different gender categories that go beyond these two conventional categories that we've had before. So that is perhaps also a false dilemma. Or even with orientation, is the person straight or gay? Well, they could be bisexual or asexual or any other number of possible intermediate categories. How about the whole love it or leave it philosophy that some people express? So where do you stand when it comes to our country? Love it or leave it? Is it a false dilemma? Sure, because there's way more options than just either loving it and totally supporting everything that happens, or leaving it and wanting to not live there. How about this as a good third possibility? Not loving it and just staying where you are and complaining, because that's totally reasonable. You're in a democracy, it's a liberal democracy, so we have the freedom and the power to express our disagreement with policies, to protest against them, and to try and change the laws through the democratic system of elections. So we don't have to love it or leave it. We can stay where we are and complain until it gets better. So, that's another example mentioned in the book as well. And so it says, America, love it or leave it. Well, that argument makes the unwarranted assumption that the only alternative to accepting the policies is to move to another country. In fact, there are many other alternatives, including working to change or improve the policies. Sometimes when we get into all or nothing thinking, then we trap ourselves into false dilemma type of fallacy thinking. So like suppose that your only thought is this: does this person love me or hate me? I'm interested in them, but I can't get a read on how they feel about me. Do they feel the same way, they're in love, or do they just hate my guts? Which one is it? Well, that's a false dilemma, because it's not like everyone has these passionate feelings necessarily one way or the other. It could just be that they're neutral, or that they're just kind of meh, just not passionately in love nor passionately full of hate, but kind of uncommitted emotionally either way. Okay, guys, and then even sometimes like people who have like eating disorders can get stuck in this type of way of thinking, and they talk about that in the book. We frequently find this type of fallacious thinking in all or nothing thinking. For example, bulimics regard eating in terms of either getting fat or binging, and then vomiting to stay thin. They simply don't see moderation as an alternative. So it's either I'm rail thin or I'm like hideously obese. the person can't see the possibility of a healthy middle ground, neutral position weight. And so that's another case of false dilemma. So anyway, try not to get roped into all or nothing questions that put you on the spot. If a person does such a thing as that, then you have to say, well, it's kind of a false dilemma that you present me with. And in fact, I think we have to expand this set of alternative options to get a real measure of what my answer would be. Sometimes in polling and surveys, we can get unreliable results because of the way that the survey is worded, and that can influence the analysis that we would make based on the survey. So like they talk about that in the book too. In one poll, when people were asked these questions, do you think the courts deal too harshly or not harshly enough with criminals? When they were only given those two alternatives, 6% said too harshly and 78% said not harshly enough. But when a third option was given, do not have enough information to say, 30% chose that option and only 60% said not harshly enough. So you would have had a really skewed viewpoint on how critical people are of the penalties we have in the law if you had gone with the first survey data, because it presents a false dilemma in the way the questions are asked, and thereby limiting people in their responses to only those two. It gives a more polarized sense of the distribution of public opinion. So anyway, watch out for either or questions that put you on the spot. If neither alternative is satisfactory, you might ask the person to reconsider the way they've presented the question, or just say you don't know. Okay, so those are all good examples of the false dilemma and the definition that it has. So what we're looking at now with the remaining part of chapter 5 is just a couple of leftover fallacies of unwarranted assumption that we can pretty quickly take care of in the beginning part of Thursday's meeting. And that's going to be questionable cause, slippery slope, and then the naturalistic fallacy. So we have 3 more of these to get into, and that won't take us too much time. Other than that, on Thursday, I kind of just want us to have a whole review of all the different fallacies, all 20, throughout all the different categories. So some of you guys maybe could even try to think of some examples of fallacies from these different categories, and then we'll use them for some in-class group activities and stuff that we'll do on Thursday to kind of fill up the time as we go away then to spring break. But I don't want to rush with only 3 minutes left through another category, through another definition. So if it's okay with you guys, maybe we'll just break for now. But let me see in the chat if everything's good, and once I see from you that that's all right, then we can close it out for today, and we'll be back on Thursday. Okay, thank you, Kayla. Good to hear from you. Appreciate it. And also, great to hear from everybody. So thanks again, everyone. Have a good day. Thanks for being here at the meeting as usual. And until next time, take it easy, and I'll be in touch with you guys. If you need anything, please email me. And like I said before, midterms have been graded by now. So let me know, and I'll get back to you as soon as I can. It might take me a day or two at the most, but I'll certainly get your reply ASAP. Okay, then. Have a good one, and I'll see you soon. All right, bye.